Welcome to our YouTube channel, Nova Scotia Home. This channel is for those like myself that came back or have chosen to make Nova Scotia home, as well as anyone who wants to know or learn more about this province in Canada. So, welcome home to Nova Scotia.
Well, here we are walking along on Beaver Bank Road. It's a little section near the bottom of what's called Barrett Lake. And why have I chosen to look at this area or talk about this area today? Well, a lot of it has to do with this turf, and I'm going to turn you around. So here we are walking along, and in this area of Beaver Bank Road, this here road takes a turn, and it takes a bit of a bend. So as we go along and trying to understand why this road takes a bend, part of the reason is going back to when this road was being built. When this road was being built, and I mean the aspect of being paved, widened, and what happened to make it this way. Well, back in the early 1950s, the Canadian government, working with the U.S. government, was installing the Canadian government, along with the U.S. government, and establishing the need for radar stations, established what was called the Pine Tree Network of radar stations. So the Canadian government, along with the U.S. government, worked to put up a radar station in Beaver Bank, and so they needed to pave the road for this base going in. The reason Beaver Bank chosen, it was one of the higher places on mainland Nova Scotia for a radar base to have the most effects for coverage in the area. Now, we go back to our story here. In the establishment of this road being paved, they started going along and literally, without notice to the residents, started surveying, and in the surveying they put markers across people's property, expropriating the property under a federal act just because they wanted the land and were putting it through, widening the road. And so today we're going to talk about a couple of those stories and what happens. So the first one here that we're walking on right now, and I'm going to turn it around. So here the road, as you see, starts to do this quick bend, turning around the corner here. And what happened is surveyors came out and they were making actually the road to be straighter. So when it came up the hill that's up in front of us there, it would take a straight cut across this property and go across and straight up to the bottom of the lake, which is just out of view right now. And what they did is, in this process of making the road straighter, they came across a little problem. And that problem was they would come out and the survey markers were gone. And what happened is the gentleman that used to live here, he came out one day, found these markers running across his yard, and it's like, what are these survey markers doing here? Or these markers and that. So he pulled them out, put them in his shed. A couple weeks later, the markers reappeared on his yard, so he took them out, put them in his shed. And then another time, he saw the surveyors out there and some government officials, and they told him that he had no choice. They were expropriating his property, and they were putting through the road straight across his property. So you can see from down there where you see it bending back, they were going to straighten it across, straight across through the trees there, and going back around. You can imagine that with this, what would happen? is you have this gentleman having the issues with the federal government, one, coming in and taking his property without formal notice. So he contacts the Premier of Nova Scotia, and the Premier says it's out of his hands, it's a federal initiative, and he has no authority against the federal government, and they are working with the U.S. government on this establishment of the roads being straightened and paved through, and the expropriations of property. So what does he do? He writes a letter to the Prime Minister of Canada. He gets no response. He writes another letter. Again, no response. He writes a third letter. Still no response from the Prime Minister's office. So he decides, okay, he's going to write one more letter. He writes one more letter, and this letter causes a reaction. A couple days later, he receives a telegram from the Prime Minister of Canada apologizing for the inconvenience and what they have done, and the surveyors and the engineers came out and some government reps, and they actually went around his property. But just to go back a little bit, the part where he was talking to them when they were on his property, they were threatening to sue him for removing and interfering with the work of the government. That's why he wrote the letters and called the Premier and the Prime Minister. So what led to this change of heart from the federal government to have him now work and do the road around his property? Well, that fourth letter, he didn't write to the Prime Minister's office. He wrote it to the Queen. And the Queen literally let the Prime Minister have it. They're expropriating it without permission from the Crown, and thereby they were told to work it out, and they were not allowed to expropriate without the Crown's permission. So that's how we ended up with this extra little bend in the road. And I was talking to a gentleman whose house you saw back up there, and he was saying he's kind of glad it worked out that way because his house was built now on where part of the road would have gone through. So he kind of appreciates the fact it didn't happen because his house is where it is. So he's kind of happy about that. Now, my next story. This gets to be a little bit more fun. As you can imagine, there's a lot of work going on. We know about the government just forcing through expropriating properties. So what happens up here is there is a bulldozer operator working on clearing, and straight up ahead by that further telephone pole just before that garage up ahead of us, there used to be a gas station and a little general store there. But before we get to that point and about the store, we have here on this corner where the bulldozer operator was working. He's going along and he's bulldozing through the ground, leveling it out, clearing it, and all of a sudden he noticed a puff of white smoke on the front of the bulldozer. Now you can imagine a puff of white smoke. He can't figuring it out. Okay, what's going on? He gets out, he looks around the bulldozer, looks on the ground, trying to figure out why is there this puff of white smoke. Can't figure it out, starts up the bulldozer, starts to move it again. Another puff of white smoke appears, and so he's like, okay, stops, checks it out, can't see anything wrong with it. And then he's like, okay, don't get it. So he starts it up, and just as he starts to move, and I just got to get a little further ahead here, but just as he starts to move the bulldozer forward, he looks up, and of course a lot of this was more cleared at the time. He looks up and he sees on this porch right here a lady holding her hands out, aiming, and pulling the trigger on a .38. And of course, instantly he sees a white puff on the front of the bulldozer. He backs off, tears out of there. So, saying, okay, well, what's she doing shooting at a bulldozer? Well, the Mounties, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, come out, and they asked her with federal reps, what's going on, and why are you shooting? There's better ways of dealing with this than shooting at the bulldozer. She goes, what was I to do? There's a bulldozer plowing across my property without my permission, damaging my yard, and I didn't have time for somebody to come out and deal with it. They were just doing this without any rhyme or reason to her. So it's what I call, they came to a negotiated settlement. So that negotiated settlement was they were allowed to continue to do the work, but they agreed to do something for her in return. And that was, and it was really interesting to see, because for as long as she lived in the house, and I'm just waiting for some traffic to go by here, as long as she lived in that house, they would manicure and take care of her yard. So that yard, the slope there, unlike any of the others, was maintained by the federal government until she was no longer living in the house. So you could say sometimes standing up to the government gets you rewarded. Today I don't think you'd be allowed to be shooting at anybody. You might think it was the Wild West, just the way it was dealt with. But it worked out, and times have changed. We do things differently. It's not all handled. I know the police would have been up in arms about it today. You shooting at somebody who's working. And right behind me here, what I talked about is there used to be, and I'll turn you around again, there used to be the variety store and gas station right here, which was the Ellis store. And behind the store you can see we have a little roadway that goes down for people that want to use the lake, you know, put little canoes or kayaks and that into the lake. So things have changed a fair bit. The road went through, of course, as you see. It's one of the busiest roads in the area. Not too much in the way of traffic control. We'd like more. But this is how it goes. So there's a couple little stories for you about Beaver Bank. Just to add another little one, like the house right in front of me here. There used to be a wood mill right here as well, and a lot of the backfill there was actually the sawdust behind the place. So I don't know if they had built on the sawdust, or if the most of the yard on the back of the house there is sawdust underneath it, but it's been filled in for a long time. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the stories, and we'll talk more. This is just a taste of the history side of the stories, and I'm giving the examples of the ones here in Beaver Bank. So enjoy these ones, and more to come. And it's not just about history here on Nova Scotia Home. We're also going to talk about other things on what to make Nova Scotia home. So learning the history in the community is a big step in being it home for you as well, or making it home for you.